Happy 4th of July, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that you are enjoying the holiday. Today I'm going to be taking a break from the series of videos I've been doing talking about the topic of moving someplace better, although there is an interesting relation here. Today I'm going to be talking about, because I think it's appropriate, what it means to be an American, or what America means to me. What should America mean to me? Why does America mean to me what it means to me? As we are celebrating the birth of American independence, what is the significance of that really? You see, as I mentioned in my previous video, I'm a little bit troubled by concepts of nationhood or national identity or ethnicity, because of the relationship we come to find with ethnicity and exclusiveness. That troubles me. But there are different ways to examine this, and I want to have that kind of conversation and at least begin an exploration of this. And so the first thing that comes to my mind is ideology as an interesting marker of nationhood, national identity, national claims, countryhood. I mean, this is a tough thing to grapple with, I believe, in a globalized or ever globalizing international community. The context is very different than it was when we were all isolated and starting with different isolated contexts throughout the world. And so let's think about this, I say. And I should say, there's an additional interesting facet, I think, of contemplating ideology here. As we think about the conception of America, and as it's evolved, though certainly imperfectly, and with a lot of hypocrisy and contradictions, in theory, there's supposed to be something rather cosmopolitan about the United States, in theory, at least according to one theory. And the whole concept of the United States of America as a country, in part, stems from this idea of, we know it all so well, right? Religious freedom. And a degree of economic freedom as well. But what does this mean, and how has this become significant to America? Is it really distinctly American anymore? And what does it mean? This is something that does trouble me, because if you look at situations like we have in the Middle East, specifically with the Israel versus the Palestinians, or if you look at Russia and Russia's claim to land where Slovakian people live, you see that there is this real sense of ethnic ties that people sense to land. But before we delve into that, I want to think about what it actually means to even claim land, and to claim land as belonging to a nation. And this is going to tie to ideology, because you have to have an ideological viewpoint to really think about what it means to claim land as yours. And again, context is really relevant, isn't it? Because it's one thing to say, as people are exploring the world and settling and colonizing on land and grappling with questions of, having a sense of law and order and security in the midst of that land on the one hand, as more benevolent, perhaps, factors surrounding a sense of nationhood. Then you've got the belligerent and awful factors that have to do, again, with ethnicity and religion and ethnocentric cultural biases Right? When we think about colonists coming to North America, whether we're talking about the Spanish, the French, or the British, and the relationships with the Native Americans, this becomes a complicated thing, doesn't it? We have a wide variety of Native American tribes who came here many, 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 many centuries ago, and didn't have really the kind of capitalistic way of thinking that the European colonists had. I think this whole concept of capitalism is really interesting. I think we can't have a conversation about America and land and nationhood without really thinking about capitalism. And I think there's different ways to think about capitalism too, because you can think about capitalism in a sort of laissez-faire, libertarian sense. You can think about capitalism in more of a social democracy sense, where capitalism is something that's imperfect, and therefore you want to ask, how do you address those imperfections? And there's obviously a sort of socialistic or fascist or, miscellaneous view on capitalism that essentially rejects its fundamental principles. And what does it mean to have capitalists come to a land that had never before been really touched with a sense of this land is to be owned, as opposed to this land is just to be used and existed on? And what does it mean to think about how we employed capitalistic or sort of capitalistic ideas about colonizing when the colonists first came to North America versus how we think about it now? Again, you can't have this conversation without context, can you? I think this is a bit of a difficult conversation to have and a sensitive conversation to have, because it is attached to genocide on the part of Native Americans and slavery and awful torture, barbarism, and things like that also was experienced by African Americans. And so we have to think about all of this as we touch on, what it means to be America. To me, part of what it means to be an American is to think about what it means to own land, or to claim that you own land, or to exist in a capitalistic context within a legacy of capitalism, and to be critical or uncritical of capitalism, and why. To me, that's probably the most inherent part of being an American, more so than the constitutional aspects, not because I'm against the Constitution or for the Constitution, but because I think you first have to contemplate the most basic fundamental philosophical notions that underpin the existence of this country. And it's interesting because it is unique. If you were to compare, say, the foundation of the United States versus, the foundation of Great Britain versus the foundation of Canada, just to give you some examples, they're very different contexts and stories. Canada, for example, really came together out of concern for things like debt and economic viability, and there was much more of a sense of, I think, fellow human mentality that Canada has a sort of fundamental legacy embracing. In the United Kingdom, I think it is very interesting. There's something more inherently, perhaps, actually democratic in a way, because even with the foundation of Great Britain, there is this legacy of the king not being able to have complete power without the support of the Privy Council, right? People who were willing to be the economic and political sustainers of the king's power, and in exchange got a bit of say, or got a bit of a connection into what the political fate of that the great United Kingdom would be. So my point is not to go on and give history lessons, actually, but to think about the fact that what it means to be an American is to acknowledge that we have a unique story, and that ours, I think, more so than being perhaps democratic or participants in our government, though that's certainly fundamental to our story, I think there's something even more capitalistic about it. Because the point is that people came to North America and said, this land is ours. And again, there are different motivating factors for why people did that, whether it was for purely economic gain or whether it was for religious freedom, and both of which are important, both of which are tied to actually certain kinds of, liberal or libertarian ideas of this value of freedom in general. And that's a conversation to have, but we have to have it tied to this idea of our relationship with land and property, or this concept of property, private property. So, let's attempt to have at it, right? Why not? And again, it's complex because of the context. So, you are a person from another country, and you find this land, and some of it seems uninhabited. Some of it is inhabited, and you want to lay claim to it. You want to say it is yours. And there's got to be these questions of why should it be yours? Just because it's unclaimed. And what about when you start to encroach on land that is inhabited by other people? We've got the Native Americans, for example, and the awful story that is the theft of Native American land and the genocide of Native Americans. In response to that, is that capitalism? Or is that people who used the pretext of capitalism to commit evil acts? Is a question to have. I haven't made up my mind with respect to all of these questions. I will tell you that I am disturbed by the genocide perpetrated against the Native Americans, and that, to me, there is no appropriate conversation about being an American or the establishment of this country and the legacy of this country without grappling with the atrocities committed against the Native Americans and how we think about what it means to sort of, because you can't really atone for it, but be sensitive to it and ask how can you begin to explore justice for a group that has been so catastrophically wronged in the name of capitalism. And what does that mean to you and me? Because it's one thing to say that people came to this North American land and some of them participated in acts of genocide outright. Others may have been philosophical supporters of it, but maybe didn't have their physical hands in it. Others, the context of political consciousness today is very different than the context of political consciousness when North America was first being colonized. Because today we have access to Facebook and Twitter and MSNBC and Fox News and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post, etc., and we can get access to all kinds of media news feeds about what's going on in the world around us, and many of us get access to a kind of education that to some degree helps us understand what all this means. But that wasn't the case when North American land was first being colonized. And I mean, it goes back to, it's interesting because we're still having a debate about the role of those with the most income, those with the most money, those with the most property, those with the most capital, those with the most resource power, and how so much of it was it was done in, it was their philosophy and their actions that led to this. Thinking about, right, the Spanish conquest of North America, it was Spanish lust for gold, and it was Spanish versions of sort of Catholic ideas and the desire to spread that through the parts of this land that they colonized, and forced the Native Americans into that we've got to think about. Again, I admit that I am probably raising a lot more questions today than I am offering answers. But that's the difference between a extemporaneous speaking contemplative video blog and writing out a theoretical article on something. I believe they are two totally different tasks. And to me, it's really more important a lot of the time to actually just talk things out. I think that spending too much time just writing things, you don't get to vet your ideas probably nearly as thoroughly and meticulously as you think you can. So I'd rather do this and have you offer your feedback. And, I rewatch all of these to think about that which I'm spouting to you and the quality of it and the contradictions that might arise or ideas that I think I might develop too. So there is a true value, in my opinion, to this method of contemplating and expressing contemplations on this subject. But I don't mean to be too all over the place here. I want to concentrate on thinking about what it means to really grapple with this capitalistic idea. And I do think it's important to understand that the colonization of North America and the theft and genocide of Native Americans is not necessarily in every context wholly an act of pure or true or of capitalism, or of capitalism as it has to be. I think that the conversation that is so appropriate for our particular time as we're heading into the 2020 elections, and you have someone like Kirsten Gillibrand who says, it's not capitalism that's the problem, it's greed that's the problem. I think, or if you look at Andrew Yang, who talks about sort of humanistic capitalism, I do think this is a very perfect time to have a conversation not about capitalism versus no capitalism so much as what is an appropriate form of capitalism. What is an ethical kind of capitalism? Can there be an ethical kind of capitalism is perhaps a question. Would there have been a context in which people could have colonized North America in a way that they could have coexisted with the Native Americans? Or were our views on land so diametrically opposed that it was bound to be one way or the other? What does the history suggest? My understanding of the history, as someone who did a bit of specialization as a college student in history, is that the history suggests we could have gotten on a lot better, and that there could have been more land that was just protected that the Native Americans could have had. I mean, people came to this continent, and there was some land that was inhabited by Native Americans, some that wasn't. And there were Native Americans who signed on to treaties. I mean, a lot of those treaties were forced, coerced treaties. And that's a conversation to have. But I think to be so cynical as to say that there couldn't have been a way to negotiate and say, well, let's find a way to partition this land in a fair and reasonable way so that you're respected and we're respected. Obviously, it didn't happen, so it couldn't have happened. But to say that it shouldn't have happened, and to think about it ethically, is a different issue to me. I think that capitalism as such is a bit of a fair idea. It is fair, of course, to ask to what extent do I have a psychological bias, a sort of confirmation bias, in support of some form of capitalism? To what degree do I support some sense of capitalism because I'm an American and it's been indoctrinated in me, or I've been so inundated with a capitalistic paradigm that I'm not capable of really digging outside that, or it makes me uncomfortable or something? To what extent am I not able to consciously recognize that? Versus, I mean, what does a logical analysis suggest? To me, I actually like an analogy here where we compare capitalism to democracy, because democracy, just like capitalism, is not perfect. One of the problems with democracy is that if the majority of your country is crazy, if the majority of your country is wrong, if the majority of your country, or the plurality of your country, is in support of policies or a philosophy or a political party or a leader that is not good for the country, what's the alternative? Right? There's that famous quote by Winston Churchill. I don't remember the quote verbatim, but the sense of it is that democracy sucks, but it's the best of the alternatives, among the alternatives. And I think you could say the same about capitalism. Because what does the major alternative offer when we think about non-democratic institutions and systems of government, non-capitalistic institutions of economy? And you have to say that the difference then is who is suddenly removed from at least having some say. By that I mean, in a democracy as much as in a capitalistic system, obviously there are going to be people with more resources, there are going to be people with more clout. You could do things to try and eat away at the profundity of inequity that we observe today. I don't think that's going commie or socialistic. I think that's a question about how much are people valuing those around them. That's a different conversation. But neither of these systems are perfect. But what's the difference between at least having some say, some freedom, and some opportunity versus having none? And what does it mean to have more? How can you maximize that? And going back to property, as I understand it, if you don't have a right to some kind of private property, then you don't have a right to do with something as you would. So an attack on private property is an attack on any kind of creativity, because that means that I can't take this book, this John Dewey book, and say this is my book and take my notes on it and have a sort of freedom of conscience engagement with this, as opposed to the state saying that this is their book, they're lending it to me, or they're giving it to me for a while, and there are guidelines with which I can't use this, or there's a timeline for it. A sort of capitalistic relationship with materials, with things, creates a more personal, humanistic engagement with the world around you, I do believe. Now, as we're thinking in terms of land and nationhood a little bit, again, I think that if you can allocate land, if we were able to conceptualize this idea of allocating land to individuals and families and saying, this is yours and nobody can violate this. I mean, inherent with that too is not just assets, capital, resource, so to speak, but privacy. Again, self, a line of individuality, a line of soul, of freedom, to the extent which we could say free will exists or volition exists, and that's a whole other loaded conversation to have, but a sort of free will experience, I believe, is maximized by some sort of capitalistic protection. But there's a difference between a kind of capitalism where, fully applied in a sort of idealistic way, we see abuses or exploitation or a very intense hierarchical competition that is almost more like an oligarchical setup, aristocratic setup. So we really have to, there's really more to capitalism than just capitalism. Like, it has to be laced with ethical viewpoints to navigate what kind of capitalism you're talking about, as opposed to a capitalism in general, in my opinion, as I'm wrapping my mind around this. And I think this is something, and this is why my top candidate for president right now is Kirsten Gillibrand, because I think she's articulating this perhaps better than anybody else. Elizabeth Warren, I think, is doing a good job too. Bernie Sanders, all the way on the bottom. I think that Bernie Sanders is not doing a good job distinguishing capitalism from socialism, is not doing a good job at standing up for what we might understand as a sort of American, we might understand as an American way of life, not to say it is exclusively American. I mean, much of the world does operate in some kind of capitalistic sense. So does much of Europe, for example, right? So it seems inappropriate to me, and this is one of the issues I have with wrapping my mind around Independence Day and American independence, is while America is perhaps a concept that arises as something that leads us to grapple with these capitalistic questions and these ethical questions, I'm not sure that I feel that I need to bind myself to an identity as an American so much as a human, like I was saying before. Anyway, this puts me at the half-hour mark, and so I don't want to go over that. I try not to. I want to thank you all for your time. I want to solicit your feedback and hear what you have to say. I hope you'd be so kind as to click like so that would increase my visibility, and I hope that you'd subscribe. And I will offer one argument in favor of why you might want to consider doing that too. And this goes back to why I'm pro-capitalist. Would you rather the kind of artistic content out there that degrades life and is anti-thoughtfulness, that is anti-conceptual, or that doesn't appreciate grappling with questions and things? Would you vote in favor of more of this? If you'd vote more in favor of this, again, I hope you'd like and share and comment and give it more attention than you would something that is, again, anti-life, destructive, decadent, etc. Again, thank you so much, and I look forward to chatting with you again very soon. Have a great day. And again, happy Independence Day. And let this be a day not just where we reflect on what it means to be Americans, but where we think about what it means to have freedom, economic freedom, and the kind of economic freedom we can protect that also maximizes quality of life. I say let this day be about finding an ethical capitalism. And with that, I'll chat with you tomorrow. Bye.